Hey there friends, I'm so glad you're here for another amazing session together. Hope you're feeling calm and doing great today. Now let's get into it. Do you think Bigfoot is just a mindless monster? What if I told you? A retired nurse once encountered not one, but 50 Bigfoots. And instead of running in fear, she felt compelled to help them. Fiona Radcliffe, a 67-year-old former psychiatric nurse from North Carolina, claimed she spent one life-changing night among them. This isn't a horror story. It's a story about compassion, and a truth almost no one is ready to believe. Her case was reviewed and verified by a veteran cryptozoologist with over 20 years of experience, who has debunked hundreds of false Bigfoot sightings. In this video you'll discover why this particular group of Bigfoot sought her out, what made Fiona the only human they ever trusted, and the heartbreaking message she brought back that might just shift your entire worldview. Fiona recorded what happened, voices, gestures, even one silent act of trust that made her break down in tears in the middle of the forest. Skip this video, and you'll keep thinking Bigfoot is just a myth. But this rare moment of humanity is being told publicly for the first, and maybe only, time. My name is Fiona Radcliffe. I'm a retired nurse, a widow, and until last autumn, I never imagined I'd speak these words out loud. I don't think I was ever truly alone in those mountains. After my husband passed in the winter of 2018, something inside me unraveled. 40 years of marriage doesn't leave quietly. His absence sat with me in every room, louder than any voice. I needed to breathe again, to hear silence that wasn't hollow. That's how I ended up in a cabin no one wanted. Half-rotten cedar siding, a metal roof that sang in the rain, and no neighbors within miles. But to me, it was perfect. The Blue Ridge Mountains held me like a cradle. Mornings started slow, a cup of black coffee on the porch while the fog rolled down the slopes like ghostly waves. My boots would leave faint prints in dew as I walked the garden rows, picking herbs I'd been growing for years. Comfrey, lavender, yarrow. By afternoon, I'd settle near the fire with a worn book and the smell of pine smoke curling in the air. There were no honking horns or grocery lists, just time, quiet, stretching, whole. And yet, beneath the peace, I felt watched. It wasn't constant, just now and then. A twig snapping too close. Footsteps that stopped when I did. Once I found deep, strange impressions near the shed, too big for any deer I'd seen, too spaced to be bare. But I brushed it off. My mind, I told myself, was just echoing stories. Mountain folk love their legends. Shadowy creatures, old spirits, forest whispers. I'd heard enough tales in the hospital break room to fill a book, but I'd never believed a one of them. Until something shifted that autumn. The wind came first, cold and fast, spiraling through the trees like it carried warnings. The leaves turned quicker than usual, going from green to rust overnight. There was an edge to the air, a stillness that didn't feel like rest. Animals I usually saw, rabbits, deer, even the nosy raccoon who liked my compost bin, vanished. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. I still told myself it was nothing, that grief makes ghosts, that maybe I'd been alone too long. But deep down, something else stirred. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. Like I wasn't being hunted, but noticed. Like I'd stepped into a place that belonged to more than trees and rock. And then the storm came. It hit in the middle of the night, unannounced and brutal. Rain pounded the roof so hard, I thought the whole thing might cave in. Wind slapped the shutters, rattling them like an angry hand. I sat in my armchair, wrapped in an old quilt, watching the fire flicker against the stone hearth while thunder roared over the peaks. It felt almost sacred, that kind of wild, like the mountain itself was trying to shake something loose. That's when I heard it, heavy, unnatural. Not the wind, not a branch, not an animal I could name. Just one sound, and I knew in my bones that it wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. I should have stayed inside. Anyone with sense would have. But when I heard that sound, deep, guttural, nothing like wind or falling branches, it felt like something old and unspoken called me. I couldn't sit still. I pulled the thick wool shawl from the coat rack and wrapped it tight across my shoulders. The house creaked around me, the way old places do in bad weather, but I moved like I was on rails. I grabbed the lantern off the kitchen counter and lit it with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. Rain was already seeping in through the cracks of the door. When I opened it, the wind punched me straight in the chest. The cold hit first. It wasn't just the kind that bites, it sank. My boots squished into the muddy ground as I stepped off the porch. Lantern held low, shielding the flame from the worst of the wind. I told myself I was just checking, just being cautious. But something inside me, maybe that old nurse instinct, knew better. Whatever had made that sound wasn't dangerous. It was hurt. I moved toward the back of the property, past the little patch of herb garden, now flattened and drowning. Every few steps, I stopped and listened. The storm drowned out most sound, but then there it was again. A low groan, barely audible but unmistakably alive. My breath caught. I rounded the side of the old tool shed, and my lantern flickered across something massive, hunched near the tree line. At first I thought it was just a mound of wet fur, maybe a bear injured and cornered. But when the light steadied, my whole body locked up. It was a creature, no animal I'd ever seen, nearly 7 feet tall, even curled the way it was, covered in thick, matted black hair that glistened with rain. Its limbs were unnaturally long, and one leg bent at a terrible angle. There was blood, dark and thick, trailing down from a wound on its thigh. Its breathing was ragged and loud, each inhale like it took effort. And then it looked at me. Those eyes, brown, almost human, wide with pain but not panic. It didn't bare teeth, didn't move to get away, just stared, not with threat, but with something closer to recognition. I stood there for what felt like forever, heart pounding, knuckles white around the lantern handle. Everything in me screamed to back away. But I didn't. I took a step forward, and then another. I kept my voice soft. "It's okay," I whispered, unsure if I was talking to it or myself. "I'm not going to hurt you." Its gaze followed me, but it didn't flinch as I came close enough to see the muscles in its chest rise and fall. Rain soaked through my shawl, and my hair clung to my face, but none of it mattered. That thing was hurt. It needed help, and I couldn't ignore that no matter what it was. With trembling fingers, I reached out and touched its arm, just barely. It tensed, a low growl rumbling in its throat, but it didn't pull away. In that moment, the world felt impossibly quiet. No thunder, no fear, just a wounded being, and the absurd calm that fell over me, the kind you only feel when you know you're doing what you're meant to do. I whispered again, "I've got you." And I meant it. I had no idea what the night ahead would bring, but walking back toward the cabin, soaking and shaking, I knew I wasn't just carrying supplies. I was carrying something ancient into my home. Back inside, I moved on instinct. My hands knew what to do, the way they always had after years in emergency rooms and hospice wards. I grabbed the old medical tin from beneath the sink, the one I kept out of habit more than need. Gauze, alcohol, a clean cloth. Then I stopped by the shelf near the fireplace and plucked a small jar filled with thick green salve, my own blend made from comfrey root, calendula, and plantain leaf. I wasn't sure it would work on whatever he was, but I wasn't about to leave that creature to suffer. When I stepped back outside, the storm still raged, but I didn't feel it anymore. The rain slapped my face, and the wind yanked at my shawl, but I moved like I was in a tunnel. Focused. Grounded. The creature hadn't moved from where I left it, though its breathing had become more erratic. I lowered the lantern again and knelt beside it, careful not to make sudden moves. His eyes flicked toward me. Not wide this time, but wary. There was pain in them, deep and sharp, but also something more, confusion maybe, or trust. I whispered again, "It's okay, I'm here." The wound was bad. The gash on his thigh had dirt and pine needles ground into it. The swelling had already started, and from the heat radiating off it, infection was not far behind. I soaked the cloth in alcohol and pressed it gently to the cut. He let out a low, gravelly groan, and his massive body jerked. I froze, expecting a swipe, but he stilled again. No anger, just pain. I worked carefully, speaking in soft murmurs as if he were one of my old patients drifting between wakefulness and sleep. "Almost done? You're doing good. I know it hurts." I don't know why I kept talking. Maybe I was trying to calm myself as much as him. Maybe part of me needed to believe he understood. After the wound was clean, I scooped a generous amount of the salve onto my fingers and gently rubbed it into the torn flesh. His skin, or hide, or whatever it was thick and warm beneath the fur. As I wrapped the gauze around his thigh, he let out a long, shuddering breath. His body relaxed slightly, enough to let me finish. I sat back on my heels, soaked and trembling, and looked into his face again. He didn't look monstrous. Not anymore. Up close he looked tired, like something that had been running too long from things I'd never understand. I stayed with him as the night dragged on. Eventually, I pulled an old camping blanket from the shed and draped it over his torso, shielding him from the worst of the rain. I lit a small fire in the clearing nearby, just enough to offer warmth without casting too much light. He shifted slightly, groaning again, but didn't move away. As the flames crackled, I sat beside him and started talking. About Daniel, my husband, about the way the mountains changed with the seasons, about how I never thought I'd live out my days in a place like this. He didn't speak, of course, but he listened. I could feel it in the slow rhythm of his breathing, a silent conversation anchored in presence alone. There was comfort in that stillness. Two creatures, broken in different ways, sharing space beneath a storm-torn sky. He wasn't just a story anymore. He was real. And somehow, against every instinct of reason, I knew I wasn't afraid. That night, I kept watch beside something the world said didn't exist, and all I could think was, what if the world had been wrong? The hours passed slowly. Rain softened to a steady patter, and the worst of the wind died down. But the air still held weight, like the storm had left something behind. I sat near the fire, the wounded creature wrapped in my blanket just a few feet away. His chest rose and fell in shallow rhythms, sometimes steady, sometimes catching. I kept an eye on him, feeling the old nurse in me stir every time he shifted or winced. My body ached from the cold, but I stayed put. Something deeper than duty rooted me there. I think he slept, or something close to it. His eyes would close, then flutter open again. I didn't dare move too far. I just kept speaking softly, telling him little stories. About the red fox I saw last spring stealing eggs, or the time a bear cub wandered onto the porch and wouldn't leave until I bribed it with honey. Ridiculous things, really, but they filled the night with something besides silence. Then the forest changed. It was subtle at first. A hush that fell too quickly. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful but tense. I noticed the birds had stopped. Not a single chirp. And then I heard it. Something shifting just beyond the firelight. Not one sound, but many. Leaves crunching under heavy feet. Branches brushing against broad shoulders. I froze. First, I thought maybe it was deer. But deer don't move like that. Slow, deliberate, circling. I leaned slightly toward the creature beside me. He hadn't made a noise in over an hour, but now his breathing had changed. Faster, alert. He wasn't asleep anymore. He let out a low rumble. Not loud enough to startle, but enough to feel through the ground beneath me. It wasn't a warning. Not to me. It sounded like a message. And then, just like that, the forest stilled. The footsteps stopped. Whatever had been moving, dozens of them, maybe more, went silent. My heart pounded. I didn't turn my head. I just stared at the fire and pulled the shawl tighter around me. I could feel them, though. A presence in the woods, not malicious, but watching. Curious. Measuring. We sat like that for what felt like forever. Him breathing heavily. Me gripping my knees to stop the shaking. The fire crackled, casting orange light against the wet trunks of pine and oak. I could see just far enough to make out the edges of the clearing. But nothing moved beyond that. Eventually, I spoke again quietly, just to cut through the fear pressing on my chest. They're not here for me, are they? I don't know if I expected an answer, but I felt him shift slightly, enough to confirm what I already suspected. I don't know what it was exactly, those unseen figures, the hush in the trees, or the way the firelight seemed too bright all of a sudden. But I knew we weren't alone. And somehow, I wasn't surprised. As the fire burned lower and my eyelids grew heavier, I caught myself listening for them, half expecting to see eyes in the shadows. But nothing came forward. The forest remained still, holding its breath. The creature beside me made a sound, low and gentle, not pain this time. A comfort, maybe. For me, I stayed awake as long as I could, but the storm's lullaby, the warmth of the fire, and the quiet reassurance of that strange being finally pulled me under. I slept on the porch that night, wrapped in wet wool and smoke, knowing, without question, that we were being watched. And for the first time since Daniel passed, I didn't feel alone. I woke with the first light of dawn slipping between the trees like gold threads on a loom. My body was stiff, cold in all the places the fire hadn't reached, and my neck ached from sleeping in the porch chair. For a moment, I wasn't sure why I felt so heavy inside, like something profound had happened and left a mark. Then I looked out and I remembered. They were everywhere. Figures. Towering, still, silent. They stood in a perfect circle around my cabin, shoulder to shoulder. At least 50 of them, each one massive, cloaked in thick fur, their silhouettes dark against the pale sky. The morning mist swirled at their feet, lending them an almost spectral appearance. I didn't move. I couldn't, my breath caught. They didn't advance, didn't speak, just watched. Eyes deep set, dark, reflecting the first hints of sunlight. I saw males, females, even a few smaller ones that could only be young. Each face bore a unique shape, distinct expressions, but all shared the same quiet awareness. There was no anger in them. No threat. Only attention, intense and focused. Then, from the far side of the circle, one figure stepped forward. This one was different, taller than the rest, but leaner. Its fur wasn't black like the others, but a pale, silvery white, soft as moonlight on snow. It moved with grace. No hesitation. I knew, just by watching, this was no ordinary member of their kind. This was a leader. Maybe something even older than that. Beside me, the wounded creature stirred. He sat up slowly, grimacing, still hurt but steadier than he had been. The moment he moved, the others shifted subtly, shoulders tilting, heads turning. But none approached. He glanced at me once, then looked toward the figure in white. The leader took a few steps closer. I watched, barely breathing, as the two locked eyes. Then came gestures, slow, deliberate. A hand to the chest. A downward sweep of the arm. A nod so subtle it was almost lost in the fog. It was a language, no doubt, though I couldn't decipher it, but I could feel what it meant. Respect, gratitude, maybe even relief. Then they both turned to me. The leader's gaze held mine, calm and profound, and for a second I felt like he could see everything. My grief, my solitude, the way my soul had been stretched thin by loss. There was no pity in that look, just understanding. The injured one let out a low, guttural sound, then reached toward me, not close enough to touch, just enough to gesture. It was subtle, but clear. A thank you, a recognition. I felt tears rise unexpectedly, not from sadness, but from the weight of being seen. The leader bowed his head slightly, a gesture so human it made my heart ache. Then, in a movement like leaves drifting in wind, he stepped back. The others began to stir. Slowly they turned, one by one, slipping between the trees with quiet, purposeful grace. I stood frozen on the porch, shawl wrapped tight around me, heart pounding, as the last of them disappeared into the forest. All that remained was silence, save for the soft drip of rain from the trees, and a faint warmth in my chest that hadn't been there before. They had come, not just to retrieve their wounded, but to acknowledge what had happened. Something passed between us that morning, wordless and sacred, and I knew I had been accepted. Even after they vanished into the woods, I stood there for a long time, arms wrapped around myself, soaking in the quiet. The forest felt different now, not empty, never that again, but somehow fuller. Like the air itself remembered. When I finally stepped down off the porch, my boots made soft prints in the wet soil. That's when I saw them, laid out gently across the top step and along the railing. Small tokens that hadn't been there the night before. My breath caught in my throat. A carved piece of cedar, worn smooth and etched with spirals. A feather, long and striped, tucked into a twist of braided grass. Stones, 5 of them, each polished and strangely luminous, like moonlight had settled inside them. One by one I picked them up with careful hands, cradling them like something sacred. These weren't random bits of the forest. They were gifts, offerings, markers of something past between us that couldn't be undone. I brought them inside and laid them out on the table like relics. The fire from the night before had gone cold, but the room held its warmth. Somehow, I sat there, just staring, until the morning sun climbed high enough to chase away the mist. In the days that followed, I never saw them again. No footprints, no sounds in the trees, but I felt them. The animals around the cabin came closer, more curious than cautious. A doe brought her fawn right up to the edge of the porch one evening. The squirrels stopped running when I stepped outside. Even the bird song seemed richer, layered. It was like the woods had recognized me as part of them now. Or maybe the veil between what I thought I knew and what had always been there had finally lifted. I didn't tell anyone at first. Not because I was afraid they'd call me crazy, though some surely would, but because it felt private, holy even. I shared the story with just 2 people, both of them old friends who knew enough about pain, about wonder, to listen without questioning my sanity. Life didn't go back to what it was before, not entirely. The loneliness I used to carry didn't disappear, but it softened. It had shape now, edges smoothed by something larger than myself. I started noticing little things more. The shape of clouds, the way moss creeps up the stones by the stream, how the forest breathes after a storm. Everything seemed to carry meaning, like the world had leaned in closer. Sometimes at night, I sit on that porch, shawl around my shoulders, and I listen to the wind moving through the pines. And sometimes, just for a moment, I swear I hear them. The soft footfalls, the rustle of limbs, a low rumble like a voice not meant for human ears. And I smile. Not because I need proof, but because I remember. I remember that night, that wounded creature, and the circle of giants who came not in anger but in silence and reverence. I remember being seen, being trusted, being chosen. This cabin, this forest, it isn't just my home anymore. It's a place where 2 worlds touched, if only for a night. And I will carry that night with me for the rest of my life, like one of those smooth stones, tucked deep in my pocket. Quiet, weighty, real. The leaves dropped, snow came and went, and spring began to curl its fingers through the forest again. Life moved on as it always does, but nothing inside me ever quite returned to how it had been. And honestly, I wouldn't want it to. I still tend my herbs, still sip my coffee on the porch, still read books by the fire while the wind moves through the trees. But everything carries a different weight now. Every breeze, every bird song, every breeze, every bird song, every branch creak underfoot. Not heavier exactly, just deeper. Like I've been let in on a secret the rest of the world forgot to notice. I've never seen them again, not directly. But sometimes I'll catch a shadow too tall for a deer sliding between trunks at dusk, or I'll hear a thump low and steady, out beyond the garden like a chest being struck gently in rhythm. I don't go looking. I don't need to. That night was enough, and if you ask me if Bigfoot is real, I wouldn't try to convince you. That word doesn't even feel right anymore. What I met wasn't a myth or a monster. He was a living being, wounded and exhausted, and he let me help him. And through that, his people, yes people, let me see something few ever do. What struck me most wasn't how powerful they were, or how many there were, or even how ancient they felt. It was the quiet, that they didn't need to make noise to make themselves known. That their respect didn't come in words, but in presence, stillness, intention. That silence was their language, and somehow I heard it loud and clear. I keep the gifts they left me in a small wooden box now, lined with soft cloth. Every so often I open it and hold one of the stones in my hand. It's cool and smooth, and every time I touch it, I feel something stir. Like the moment before a word is spoken, or the breath before a song begins. I know most people won't believe this story. That's all right. Belief isn't the point. Connection is. And I think that's what they were trying to show me. That kindness, when it's real, doesn't need to be explained. It just is. On quiet evenings, I'll sometimes whisper a thank you out into the trees. Not loudly, just enough to let them know I remember. That I haven't forgotten who stood in that circle. Or who placed a hand over his heart before fading into the trees. That night changed something in me. It reminded me that even in our loneliest hours, something might be watching. Not to harm, but to understand. To wait for the right moment. To step forward when it matters most. So I sit, and I wait too. Not for another encounter, but simply to honor the one I had. To be still. To listen. Because out here, in the hush between wind and wood, I learned something I never did in all my years of nursing, or marriage, or grief. Sometimes the most powerful bonds don't begin with words. They begin with silence, and they never truly end.